All right, we good? Awesome.
All right, everybody, let's give it up for Zach. And he's about to start. Let's do it.
All right, yeah, thanks for the intro. Definitely love, I usually watch this online on Twitch. Took me about an hour and a half to get here, but I love coming and presenting as well. So we're gonna jump right in here to my talk. So it's about unit testing in React. I feel very passionate about unit testing in general. I enforce an 80% minimum test coverage on all of my repos, which actually just had a QA person ask me why I was so strict. And I was like, well, how many bugs do you find? He's like, well, not as much with yours. I'm like, exactly. It breaks my build, so you can't even test my code if I haven't tested my code. So I feel very passionate about that, and I love testing, but when I started getting into the front end, specifically React, I found testing to be a little more difficult than I was used to in the back end and the middle tier type of software I had been used to as a full stack dev. Really, I started fully working on the front end about a year ago. And now I make micro front ends and as well as a supporting component library. So I use Storybook, which you all got to see a lot in the last session. I actually just did a color page very similar for two of our design systems in the same Storybook. So my component library supports multiple design systems because Cox Automotive as a whole has numerous brands. And so we're trying to really use the same components, but have a different look and feel based on that brand. So what we're really going to cover here in this talk is what to test and what not to, and then how to do that with React testing library. So we're going to talk about how we should test all kinds of components, not just your class components, even though they might seem more complicated than the functional. We should test that functions do get called, but we shouldn't test like specific business functionality and business rules within our component level tests. Those should be separated out into their own tests. We're going to talk about how we don't really want to test with API calls that actually get ran from the browser. I saw someone yesterday not mock out their API call, and they made a lot of data churn on one of our services. Thankfully, it was the non-prod, but it was a lot of extra data and confused a lot of people. And so we're going to talk about how to test rendering and then querying the DOM and just strictly focusing on the DOM, again, getting away from the business logic itself. Like you don't want to test your math when you're testing if your component renders and the classes that are there and how it looks. And then we'll talk about mocking those API calls as well. We're not going to talk about Enzyme. Enzyme has been great, what I started with. And originally when I started this talk, I was going to talk a little bit more about how to convert from Enzyme to React testing library. About a week after I started kind of mapping out this talk, React testing library started shipping by default with Create React App. And that's what I always recommend people start with anyhow. So I decided to kind of cut that out and skip that. And the main reason I had started using React testing library before it even made it to Create React App is that I had some trouble with context and hooks when those came out using Enzyme. And also I just liked really how it made you think about testing and how you should test. So with Enzyme, the keyword on their website that I noticed in their tagline is simulate there. You're reaching into the component and simulating a click rather than telling the browser or telling Jest DOM that you clicked on something. And that is actually a big difference in my opinion. And we're also not going to talk about testing in the browser at all. So things like Cypress, Selenium, I'm wearing an Axe Deck shirt, or Wave, things to test accessibility. Those are all really good and they're the next level after unit testing in my opinion. So we're not really going to talk about them, but they do help enhance your test suite, and I definitely recommend getting into them as well. So getting started, we're going to run, when we run Create React App, we actually do get an example test for us to look at. And it uses that testing library, the React version like we talked about. It's built on the DOM testing library. has a lot of stars on GitHub. It's already made into Create React App, so we can be pretty sure it's pretty good. It also written by Kent C. Dodds, who's a really prolific open source coder, and I really trust his work. He's also really active in the community. I've had some discussions with him via Twitter on how to test certain things, and I've learned from him, and he's validated some of the approaches I've taken, so it was pretty cool to be able to interact with stuff like that there. And the tagline on the repo is a simple and complete React DOM testing utilities that encourage good testing practices. So yes, good is opinionated, and my talk is going to be opinionated. This React testing library really fed into a lot of how I think about testing, and that's why I really recommend it. And essentially, it wants you to use the code as it was intended to be used in the browser. So instead of messing with state from outside of the component, instead of changing the props from underneath that component after it's been rendered or simulating a click, you're really just going to tell the browser that you clicked on something and watch what happens next. So in React testing library, you can't access the state. You can send in props, but you don't necessarily know what that component does with those props. And so this leads into kind of the 3 layers of component unit testing that I try to practice and help my team practice as well. Start at the bottom with render testing. So my first test is, does this thing even render with the default props? If not, I might as well scrap my code. But that's the first test. And I don't necessarily do test-driven development. I kind of flip-flop back and forth. For me, it's whatever works, but I always run my tests before I push. If I'd never want to give anyone else broken code, developers, QA, definitely customers. So then once I check those default props, I'm gonna move on to a combination of other possible props. Try and hit just multiple combinations there. Is it still rendering correctly without just the defaults? And then actually testing the side effects of the props would be next. So I'll give an example in a minute, but in accordion, if I tell that trigger handle to be on the left with the prop, is it actually on the left? And we'll have to figure out how to test that. And then interaction testing is the third, side effects of things of clicking buttons and links, and does that do the correct thing in the DOM that you expected? So here's the first example here. Does it render with the default props? This is basically that first example unit test that you get where it'll test the app if you run Create React App. So here, this is literally from a production component library that's running on multiple websites. And this was the first unit test I wrote for the accordion that I wrote. Does it render without errors? It uses all the default props, and it does pass, but you know, I have a test runner, and I also build that into my CI/CD pipeline. So the next step was, did it render, or does it render with a combination of any other props? So I'm gonna give it a title, which does turn into the top of the accordion there, and then tell the trigger to be on the left-hand side. So that's the handle, that's like the chevron that you click on to open and close the accordion. And I'm still not really going down deep into what actually that means, other than does it render in the DOM? So then the next step is to actually figure out, did it render correctly? So this render, which is supplied by testing library, it just throws it right on the DOM for us, and we can actually use document.get anything, any of those things we're used to from vanilla.js to go inspect the DOM and see and look at, and then write assertions in Jest. So if we're expecting that to be on the left, since we wrote the component, can look at the source code, we know that it should get the class left on the trigger handle if we pass in this prop. So we can test that in the DOM right here. So next, we're also going to test the title as well. So you can see we passed in just the title this time. And we're going to use the helper function that's also provided by React Testing Library. So a lot of these are pretty cool, and I'll go into more detail in a couple minutes. But there's the get by text one is something that is really easy to use. Since we know our title is going to be displayed somewhere as title, and we are only rendering this component. We're just going to run a get by text, which has to be a function returned from your render. And then we're gonna double check that it's just in the page. So you could do this. You could do this sort of assertion multiple different ways. You could just check if it's true, if it's truthy, or if it exists. There's multiple different ways to do that with React Testing Library. For some reason, I felt like doing that today, or when I wrote it. It works, but there's definitely at least 5 different ways to actually write that assertion. So these helper queries, there's 8 main like categories of those queries. There's the label text, the placeholder text, the text by text that we talked about, display value, alt text, title, role, and test ID. Test ID is something that is, I feel like, more unique to React Testing Library. So that's a data attribute that you can put on any of your components to just aid in unit testing if you don't have specific enough IDs or class names already that you can go and access via the DOM. And they're broken into, or there's 6 different modifiers that you put in front of those for the queries. So you can do, so you have get by or get all by. So either returns one or an array, or query by and query all by, as well as find and find all by. And the find functions themselves, they are asynchronous. So you don't have to, so you can actually just await for your component to load if there's any sort of timers or anything that are running that are finite. You can easily get around trying to mock out just timers by using the find. Here's another example of how you can get by text. If you're throwing, and this is actually directly from one of the documentation sites, and it also shows off the extend expects from the Jest part of the testing library. So to be in the document is another one of those truthiness types of expectations we can put on to our tests. The third level of that pyramid was the interaction testing. So I'm going to test out side effects, and are they going to be correct when I fire a click. So here's another really good example from the docs. So this page component, right when it loads, it doesn't do anything except show a button. You click the load button, and then it makes an API call and shows a list of things, of items. So this shows off, so you can use the find by text and await it with, this is regex to actually get all of your items. So then you're expecting your items to have the length 10. So by the time your regex completes, this test does pass. So in the last component, it did make an API call, but we don't want that to actually happen. So we'll talk about mocking that out a little bit. So this is an example of a user component that does fetch data right upon load. So we're using a use effect hook here to go get that user data from a locally hosted API on the same port. And then we'll display the name and the age of the user that we got based on the ID we passed in. So first we have to create the data that we're gonna mock out. So we have the fake user, that's me. I live in Phoenixville, so it's a little bit of hike, but we got here. And then we're gonna mock out fetch, since we used fetch in the component there. They want me to all right. I have like corporate stuff showing up for some reason on here, but it's not sharing, so that's good. Yeah, so we used fetch to go get our data this time. So we can use Jest to mock out, a promise resolver for fetch and make it return this fake user object here. So we'll pass in ID 123. And when it runs the fetch call, it's going to automatically return our fake user. So then we can go into the DOM and look at the summary and the strong tags here. So I wrote this component. I know they're going to be the first ones. So it was easy to test, and I'm going to expect their content to have the name and age I passed in. Then we're going to remove that mock since we're done with it in this test. Oops, sorry. And then here's an example of mocking Axios calls, which I know a lot of people use. I actually use Axios in most of my micro front ends right now to help with middleware, as well as some more advanced mocking setups that we do with our unit tests. So we have the same fake user being set up here within this test. And then we just need to set up a mock adapter, which is brought in from the mock Axios package. And then we tell it on the get of 123, which is that same ID there that we're passing in. We're going to reply 200 with that fake user, that's me, and the same sort of assertions here. The mock adapter does dispose at the end of your test, so you don't necessarily have to go tell it to dispose. So that's why we don't have that same last line like we did for the fetch mock there. And then here's an example using context. Use style components, their theming engine for my design systems, and that's how we pass everything down to all the components. So let's say we had theme A, we would just pass that in the theme provider, do all our imports at the top and everything, and that accordion would render with that theme actually specified. There's nothing special we need to do in React testing library to get context to work. And that was definitely something very different than Enzyme when I was trying to use it with the context we were setting up. And so now that you know how to do the kind of the basics of that testing pyramid I presented, the next step really is to choose an overall minimum coverage, in my opinion. So I use 80 on everything. So that's 80% of lines, 80% of functions, 80% of branches. That's your if statement, case statement, switch statement stuff, as well as statements in general. So you could have kind of the basics of that testing pyramid I presented. Hi, James.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, James. We're Zach's just finishing up, so if you could mute your mic, please. Thanks.
Sorry, I was trying to be proactive.
No worries. That's why we love you. Thanks so much.
Cool. So yeah, I just went 80% across the board. Statements are technically different than lines because you can have a statement go more than one line. I always run my tests before I push. I try to instill that in the rest of my team, but it runs on our build server, so I can tell if they didn't and shame them accordingly with a private message. First, if they don't fix it, then, you know, might have to call them out a little bit. And then, but, you know, there's always an exception to the rule. If you're going on vacation, you're really trying to finish something up, but you're handing it off, you actually want to, you know, tell your teammate, hey, I couldn't get all this done. This is where I'm at. Yeah. So there's some resource links. I'm going to definitely share out these slides to the Discord that I'm pretty active in. I recommend you all join for sure. And I'll post it in the meetup as well if Discord's not your style. And thanks. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
So we got other Zach first.
Zach.
I noticed in all of your tests, you didn't have snapshots. Do you have a personal stance or you just didn't cover them?
Yeah, I didn't cover them. I do not find snapshots to be particularly useful if you are trying to just test the limited functionality of the DOM itself. Also, I do find that, at least in our component library, things are changing so much so frequently that the snapshots are invalid like half the time. So it's really tough. I think when you get to a stable point, which is a moving target, but it's really a team decision to turn them on. But I've found that most people want to ignore them anyways. So not a huge fan, but I want to get to where I think we can actually use them. Definitely like sounds like a good goal for sure. Do we have another question over here? Yeah.
Here I come, Tom.
So I guess I've heard people say like a percentage of the testing that they want to hit.
Mhm.
Is there a tool that you use to know that, or?
Yeah, so when you set up Jest, you can set that up to collect coverage, and it's a command line parameter, and then to collect the coverage itself, and then the setup is either in your Jest config file or in your package.json. So I can add an example into this when I send this out for sure. Cool.
We got time for one more.
Back right.
Oh, Nate. Oh, man. And I used to run distance too, believe me.
I love asking questions. I also love testing, but I'm also a back-end person, so I'm not used to testing front-end components. This is really cool for me. One of the hard parts when you're testing something is like deciding what unit test to write, right? Like, because if you have a function that has an int, you want to test 0, negative numbers, positive maximum number, and then negative maximum number you can get. So how would you go about choosing the different cases, and how do you know that you have like enough?
I definitely try to follow all those same rules for props. If there's an extensive amount of options for a prop, you try to follow those minimum rules. You get the maximum case, the minimum case, 3 in between, depending on how many there are. A lot of the props that I usually use, though, there's like a maximum of 5 for each prop. So I'll just test them all.
And you write all of those, like the combinatorics of all of those yourself, or do you have like a tool that might be able to generate those?
Copy paste.
That's fair enough.
Cool.
All right, Zach.
All right. There's my Twitter and my email. If y'all want to contact me there, I hang out in the Discord too. Thanks, everyone.
Let's give it up for